Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. We now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is impossible for me to explain to the folks I work for, and I suspect most of my colleagues would have similar difficulty explaining to the people we work for the pervasiveness and longevity of government waste, fraud, and abuse. And I commend you for gathering with us today to seek solutions. And I want to start with the one that I find most compelling, which would be criminal consequences. Do you have an estimate, and I'll throw this open to all four of you, an estimate, negligence, gross negligence, criminal negligence? Where is the preponderance of the waste, fraud, and abuse? Where does it fall in that paradigm? Not all at once.
I can tell you from the Medicare and Medicaid side, a lot of what happens in terms of the prosecution of fraudulent claims within CMS, unfortunately, does not occur until it meets a certain threshold of money. So a lot of these claims.
Whose threshold is that?
I'm sorry?
Who sets the threshold?
It's within CMS, and they're the ones who determine, based on their allocation of resources, what claims that they can go after.
Well, let me ask you about the allocation of resources, because if my numbers are correct, there are almost 50 different investigative agencies, in quotes, that are seeking waste, fraud, and abuse just within healthcare. That alone is an example of waste and fraud and abuse. 50 different agencies?
And a huge irony that exists within that, and it's an excellent point, is that there is waste that's going on between all those organizations, in the sense that there's a lack of data sharing that's going on between them. So for instance, even within, let's say, Medicare Part A and Part D, you're missing data sharing between those two that they would be able to use to identify who potential crooks are. And so as a result, they're losing out on being able to cross-reference these individuals, and some of these people might actually be claiming to be legitimate suppliers for Medicare Part A when they were already identified as a potential fraudulent supplier for Part D. And so that lack of interaction, that lack of sharing, is leading to a lot of the negligence that you're speaking of.
Well, it's also inexplicable. It is impossible to understand, to explain to anybody outside this zip code, how you can have that. And with respect to the question asked by my colleague from the District of Columbia about carrots and sticks, I prefer the sticks. So tell me what is being done with respect to criminal prosecution, consequences, to ameliorate what has been, if my numbers are accurate, a 2-decade-long acknowledged problem. How many investigations have been started? How many matters? How many declinations by the U.S. Attorney's Office?
We can provide that information to you for the record. There are reports that the Inspector General has put out that show the matters referred, how many have been investigated, and the prosecutions that have been prosecuted as well. So we can provide that information to you. And the thresholds typically are set by the Justice Department in terms of how much monetary money would have to be sort of broached before they would feel it would be efficient and productive to go through the judicial system in that process. But those figures are available. We will provide them to you.
Okay, thank you. I would yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield for just
a
moment? In the case of the question of prosecution, is the biggest problem the lack of prosecution from your studies, or is it the lack of catching in real time these individuals before the money is taken? Which do you think leads to more of the long-term abuse? The fact that people can continue stealing again and again in various ways, or the fact that we don't prosecute them at a low enough level?
While we haven't studied that issue directly, Mr. Chairman, I think part of the issue is that it's not that you can continue to abuse the system with low potential gain caught. So I think that just intuitively, just to tell you from that standpoint, I'll be happy. I'll go back and take a look and see if we have a more definitive.
Okay, and one follow-up question on an earlier one. Wouldn't it be impossible for the government to contract directly with everyone, meaning At some point, the government does have to rely on general contractors to do jobs. Thus, it's inevitable that you will have a contractor hiring other contractors.
Yeah, as long as it's in a typical prime contract, subcontractor mode, I think that's fine. But when the government contracts out its responsibility to oversee the prime contract, then I think you have an issue.
Which we all agree with. We now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased with this hearing and frankly think that if we spent the rest of this year just dealing with the issues that were raised here and actually got some results, we would have done our job. I have much frustration with the fact that we hold hearings, we uncover problems, and then nothing happens. To you, Comptroller, congratulations on your official appointment. You have a high-risk list. There are agencies that stay on this high-risk list year after year with no penalties, no results, no changes. And I think that that is inexcusable. And if you need to have more authority to force these agencies to do what you recommend, then we should introduce legislation to make sure that that happens, because we look foolish, and the American people look at us as if we are totally ineffective when we cannot deliver once we have uncovered a problem. Let me move on to an area that you just editorialized in the New York Times about just 2 days ago. A percentage of the proceeds from gas and oil companies that drill on federal lands are supposed to be paid. And evidently, according to a report, there's substantial funds that could be generated, some $9 billion in fiscal year 2009. But it appears that it is on your high-risk list in part because the oil and gas companies aren't paying their proper share. So I guess my question is, how long have they been underreporting? Why do we allow them to underreport? Why aren't the taxpayers getting the proper payments that they should be receiving, because the drilling is going on federal lands?
Basically, I had agreed as a result of earlier question to go back and provide a listing of the underreporting point. What I would say, though, there are really a couple issues. One, there's too much reliance on self-reported data that needs to be checked. Secondly, we found problems with the verification process that the Interior Department is supposed to use to make sure that the production figures are correct as well.
Wait a minute, excuse me.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that the oil and gas companies are self-reporting and we're supposed to trust them?
Well, there's supposed to be checks that are put in place as well.
By whom?
By the Interior Department.
And are they?
Well, that's what we found some gaps in that, and also the verification of the production numbers, which are things that we believe need to be addressed, and that's one of the reasons we're highlighting this as a high-risk area. The other reason is that the federal government's basic system to assess what the cost would be for federal leasing hasn't been revisited for 25 years. And that when the federal government's, what it charges for leasing on federal lands is compared to what's charged in other countries or even some states, it ranks extremely low in its charges to begin with.
Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that we have a hearing specifically on this issue. The taxpayers deserve to get fair market value for the leases that they provide to anyone, be they the next door neighbor or an oil and gas company. And I think we should be getting what's justifiably ours. We're the stewards of the taxpayers' money, and I think this is a ripe area. I'd like to move very quickly to the Alaska Native Corporation. I don't know if you've looked into it. If you have not, I would request through the committee that you do so. The Washington Post did a piece on November 26th, which is astonishing to me. Anytime you allow for sole contracts, sole source contracts, there is mischief that's going to take place. And in this case, evidently, a contract for $250 million was offered to a subsidiary of the Alaska Native Corporation, a gentleman living in Delaware. His office was his colonial 4-bedroom home, and he was providing sexual assault and harassment training. except he had no experience doing that, and his last contract with the government was for $73,000, and it was for janitorial services. There's been $29 billion provided to the ANC over the last decade, most of the money not going to the natives, most of them going to the non-natives. It is an absolute abuse of the program, and I think we should look into that as well.
Yeah, we've issued reports in the past on that with recommendations. We're currently looking at it again, and we'd be happy to share.
Okay, but that's my problem. You issue reports, nothing happens, and then there's another story written because we haven't done anything about it. I want to be part of a committee this year that actually delivers on results, not just have a bunch of hearings, but show that we are saving the American taxpayers' money, and I yield back.